Good evening, everybody. My name is Tennille Murray. I'm the Community Engagement Director at AJA. I'd like to thank you all for joining us this evening, especially those who are here live with us on the Zoom, those who are watching live on Facebook, and everybody who's watching the recording tomorrow or later tonight on YouTube or J Air Community Radio. We have a very special guest tonight, but I'd like to hand over to our founding member, Michael Bird, and a very good friend of the AJA, who will introduce our guest this evening. Before I do that, we'll let you know that for security purposes, this evening we have blocked the chat at the moment. So if you have a question for Richard, when we get to the Q&A portion, you can use the hand up button that's below, and then we'll know you're in line to ask a question. Please welcome Michael Bird.
Thanks very much, Tennille. I'll try and be brief because if I had to give a full list of Richard's accomplishments, it would take the whole hour session. But Colonel Richard Kemp, CBE, Commander of the Order of the British Empire, has 3 decades of experience in the British Army fighting terrorists and insurgents. He commanded British forces in Afghanistan, Iraq, Northern Ireland, the Balkans, and elsewhere. From 2002 to 2006, he headed the International Terrorism Team at the UK government's Joint Intelligence Committee. He also chaired the Strategic Intelligence Group at COBRA, the UK National Crisis Management Committee. Richard's name was also discovered on an Al-Qaeda kill list in 2013. Richard has been present during each conflict between Israel and Hamas since 2008 and has been in Israel since the beginning of the current Gaza war. In fact, he's just arrived back from Israel. He's in the UK tonight. Richard has been published in numerous articles and on social media, and he has been sharing the truth about this war and in particular about the Israel Defense Forces. In my view, Richard Kemp's presence at the United Nations defending the morality of the IDF in front of a hostile audience has been his most outstanding achievement as far as Jews are concerned. Thank you sincerely, Richard, for giving us your very precious time away from your very busy schedule.
Richard. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Michael. I really appreciate your kind words. It's also a great pleasure to join everyone who's listening here, and particularly to do so on behalf of AGA, which is an incredibly effective pro-Israel Zionist organization that sets, I think, an example to many other organizations around the world who would do well, I think, to emulate the work that AGA does. I've done a lot of stuff in the past with AGA, and indeed I'm looking forward in a few days' time to coming to Australia, invited by AGA, organized by AGA. I'm looking forward to meeting hopefully as many of you as I possibly can in the time that I'm in Australia. I would also say that the work done by AGA to support Israel in this desperate time is deeply impressive. And one thing I think we should all remember, because it's a hard time, not just for Israel, it's a hard time certainly for Jews in the UK and in the US and in Australia and elsewhere around the world, where very frequently they're getting demonized and often intimidated, particularly, I think, students on campuses, but not just that, also people, for example, who venture into London at the times, particularly of some of the major anti-Israel protests, pro-Hamas protests that are going on. My view is, for everybody who's engaged in sticking up for Israel at this time, including members of AJA and others, my view is we shouldn't see any of this as a burden that we have to bear. Of course, it's a terrible situation, but it's also, I think, an honor to be living in this time, in a time when we can actually do the right thing and stick up for Israel. And I think that goes also for those university students who are willing to stand up, hold the Israeli flag in the face of the intimidation that they have. So I don't consider, I do as much as I possibly can and maybe it's not very much as a mere goy, but I do everything I possibly can, and I consider it an honor to do so. So as Michael said, I was in Israel since the 9th of October, pretty much solidly. I've been out of the country for 2 separate times, each of about a week. Otherwise, I've been in Israel. I've been visiting IDF units. I've been holding meetings with Israeli military and political leaders. And I've had the real pleasure also of meeting a very large number of lone soldiers in different places on different fronts, whether it's up in the north on the Lebanese border or on the Gaza border, or indeed inside Gaza. And included in those numbers of lone soldiers I've met quite a significant number of Australians who are, representing both their faith, their country as Australians, and also, of course, Israel. And I think you can all be very, very proud of those lone soldiers, those young men and women who have, in the past or at present, fought for the state of Israel. And also, I should say as well, I've met quite a lot of Australians who have been visiting Israel during this war. And it's not an easy thing to do necessarily, with all the uncertainty and the potential dangers of anyone living in Israel. But I do think it's so important for Australians, as well as British, Americans and others, to be in the country at this time if they possibly can, even if it's only to give moral support to the Israelis. I can't tell you how much they appreciate the presence of Jews and non-Jews also from outside the country going to show them solidarity. And I had dinner. You'll have to excuse me for not understanding fully the Jewish religious terminology, but I had dinner with an Australian family from Melbourne on the last night of Passover, one of their members of the family is also on a program in Israel, both learning about Israel, helping to support Israel physically by volunteering as well. So I think that's something that is deeply impressive from those Australians who have been to Israel and will be going to Israel during the course of this conflict. I mentioned I've been visiting Israeli soldiers. I've been deeply impressed by everything I've seen of them. Of course, there was the horrors and the abject failure on the 7th of October. But one thing we shouldn't forget about the 7th of October is the cases of immense heroism. I've met many people who did some incredible things, risking their own lives, risking their limbs by going down and helping to get rid of the terrorists that invaded Israel on the 7th of October. So some incredible acts of heroism down there, which we shouldn't forget. When I first arrived in Israel on the 9th of October, obviously it was still very raw, and indeed there still were some terrorists active inside Israel at that time. I visited Sderot, Kfar Aza, Berry, some other places that were the main targets of the attack. There were still some corpses lying around, not, I'm happy to say, any corpses of the Jews that were killed there, but some corpses of terrorists. It was a very raw experience, and I witnessed scenes of mayhem and destruction and violence after the event, of course, but very soon after the event, which were far in excess of anything I've seen in 30 years serving in the armed forces in a number of different wars. I also watched a video that the IDF put together, about 45 minutes of camera footage and telephone footage of what happened. And two things that struck me about that. One was, apart from the sheer horror of what was going on, which was very, very hard to watch, but two other things struck me, one of which was the professionalism, if you could call it that, of the terrorists that were invading. And let's not forget, more terrorists from Gaza invaded Israel that day than the British Army sent troops to go and liberate the Falkland Islands back in the 1980s. It was an extremely large operation. And the people involved in it, most of them were well trained, well organized, working as teams, acting like soldiers. These were people clearly who had significant training, and that training, I think, will have come from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and Hezbollah, both, of course, Iranian elements, as indeed Hamas are. And the second thing that struck me was the sheer joy and pleasure on the faces of the people murdering, torturing, raping, and otherwise bestializing the Jews that they came across. It was something that was, I think, probably the most chilling aspect of the whole thing, how pleased they were to be doing it. And we can obviously understand that in the context of the indoctrination, anti-Jewish indoctrination they have received almost since birth. I went into Israel, I beg your pardon, I went into Gaza on the ground with the IDF several times since the war began, and I witnessed probably the most complex and difficult, demanding military operations that any army has ever had to fight. That's on the basis of, first of all, this is predominantly an urban area. An urban conflict is well known among soldiers as being the most difficult and demanding battleground to fight on, far more so than the desert, the jungle, or any other environment. Then you add to that the fact that Hamas have had decades to prepare this ground for exactly this moment. Ambush positions, escape routes, sniper positions, all of the different pre-positioning weapons, all of the different things that make it very hard for the IDF to fight. Then, of course, you have the tunnels, the hundreds of kilometers of tunnels underneath the Gaza Strip. That battle itself is unique in warfare. No other army has had to fight this extensively in a tunnel system. And the IDF have developed some incredibly effective means of dealing with that. On top of that, you've got a massive civilian population. The IDF have to fight in among the civilian population to try and eliminate Hamas terrorists who are deliberately fighting from within the civilian population. And I'll speak a little bit more about that in a moment. The next dimension to add, of course, is the hostages. And, you know, we don't know how many hostages remain in Gaza now alive, but we know that a large number of hostages were there at the beginning. And fighting in an environment that with all the characteristics I've just described, plus the presence of hostages whose lives must be preserved at all costs, adds an extra dimension. Again, this is not something any other army has had to deal with in history. And then finally, there are other complications, but the final major complication is the spotlight of the world's media on what the IDF is doing. And we've seen how that plays out and how that media coverage, which is much more intense than, for example, the British forces or American forces or Australians had to deal with in other conflicts. And we've, you know, like I say, we've seen how that coverage, in many cases, and I'm thinking particularly of the BBC, but I'm sure it applies to many other broadcast organizations, how they fuel not only the anti-Israel attacks, but the attacks and violence, intimidation against Jews around the world. So this is terribly difficult. Despite that, the IDF have made some incredible progress. They've destroyed a significant amount of Hamas's military capability, a very significant amount. They've killed something like 1,300 to 1,500 terrorists. They've captured hundreds of Hamas and Islamic Jihad terrorists and interrogated them and gained intelligence from those interrogations, as well as from seizing Hamas computers and telephones and other technical equipment, which has enabled them to be even more precise and specific about their operations. Hamas now is reduced to, I think, something like 4 battalions, maybe a few more battalions, but around 4 battalions in Rafah, and some other units elsewhere in the Gaza Strip. But they're no longer able to fight as a large-scale, coherent military organization. And if and when, and I think it's probably when, the IDF go into Rafah, that will see the destruction of Hamas as a major threat to Israel. Of course, it's not the end of Hamas. Of course, there will be attempts to regenerate Hamas. There will still be individual and small groups fighting in Gaza and trying to reconstruct the organization. And that means that the IDF will have to maintain, in my view, a permanent presence in Gaza for the foreseeable future. I'm not talking in terms of months. I'm talking years, probably decades of permanent presence in Gaza to suppress a resurgence of anything like Hamas. I should just comment on one very important thing, which is commonly used as a weapon against Israel, and that is civilian casualties. And of course, Hamas, their entire strategy is designed to get the IDF to kill as many Gazan civilians as they possibly can in order to achieve what they're achieving now, which is the vilification, the isolation of Israel, the condemnation of Israel, and pressure on Israel, international pressure to stop Israel fighting. Because the only way that Hamas survives intact is for the IDF to be stopped attacking Hamas. And we're seeing pressure all the time for ceasefires, for restriction and restraint on their military operations. So civilian casualties are critical. Humanitarian aid also is being used as a weapon. And there are lies being talked about famine and starvation in Gaza, when we also see scenes of Hamas terrorists hijacking aid, using it for terrorist purposes, selling it in some cases at inflated prices to the civilian population, and in some cases people throwing aid away because it doesn't taste good. So the exaggeration about the conditions, of course the conditions for people in Gaza are very bad, but they're not, in my view, certainly in terms of hunger and starvation, they're not as bad as many in the media would like to suggest. I think I just want to go back briefly to the civilian casualties. The latest Hamas figure from the Gaza Health Authority, which is of course controlled entirely by Hamas, the previous figure was something like 33,000 of that sort about a week or so ago. Hamas then reduced that figure to 21,000. I think partly because they have seen so much analysis in the media of their figures to show that they're lies, that they decided to bring it to a more modest figure in order to avoid being exposed as lying. So they reduced it to around 22,000 a week or so ago. If you take that figure as being true, and I don't say it is true, I don't know if it's too few or too many, but let's assume that is a correct figure, around 22,000. We won't find out the reality for quite a long time, but we don't know any better now. If you take the 13 to 15,000 terrorists I mentioned, that obviously has to be deducted from that figure, that the 13 to 15,000 terrorists that the IDF believe they've killed. So take that away. Then you must take away from that figure those people that Hamas themselves have killed, either by rockets dropping short into Gaza, which is estimated around 20% of all those fired, a very large number. Many of them will have killed a lot of people. Then you take away people that Hamas have murdered deliberately, which is also going to be a significant number, and the people who have died of natural causes out of a population of 2 million over 6 months. That's going to be quite a lot. Take all that away. We don't know the exact figures, but my estimation is at worst, on the basis of those figures, the IDF have killed 0.8 civilians for every combatant killed, 0.8 to 1. That's terrible. It is terrible. It's terrible that civilians die. But this environment, it's impossible for that not to happen. It compares very favorably with other Western armies. The UN have put out a statistic a few years back that the civilian to combatant casualty ratio in urban conflict since the Second World War is about 9 civilians to every combatant killed, 9 to 1. In Iraq and Afghanistan, respectively, it was 5 and 3 to 1 by American forces. That's an estimate, of course. So 0.8 to 1, which is my estimation, is extremely low, and it shows the efforts and the extent to which Israel has been conducting its military operations to minimize the deaths of innocent civilians. The opposite of what is being claimed by the media, by the United Nations, by some governments, and in university campuses, which is unfortunately is pure lies and distortions. Now, I'm happy to take any questions about Gaza. I want to briefly speak about the Northern Front, Lebanon. Since the 7th of October, Hezbollah, one of the most powerful, probably the most powerful and effective terrorist organizations in the world, has been launching rocket, drone, anti-tank attacks against Israeli forces and civilians in the north of Israel. Ever since the 7th of October, almost every day, these have continued, some with great intensity. The IDF have been conducting very effective counter operations against Hezbollah and have killed large numbers of Hezbollah terrorist leaders. That continues. The IDF is continuing to be effective, but this is not going to be the end of the story unless there is some kind of diplomatic breakthrough forcing Hezbollah north, which I think is very unlikely, but could happen. Unless that happens, Israel is going to have to fight intensively in southern Lebanon to drive Hezbollah north or to destroy them, probably both. And I think that is an inevitability. It may happen before, it may not happen until the IDF have finished off Hamas in Gaza. Either way, I think it's almost inevitable. I've been living for the last 6 months with refugees from Kiryat Shimona, one of the largest town closest to the Lebanese border. Those people have been living as refugees effectively for 6 months. They're desperate to go home. They can't go home because of the threat from Hezbollah. And their big concern is that there will be another 7th of October in the north. Of course, all this is orchestrated by Iran. Hamas is an Iranian proxy, Islamic Jihad is, Hezbollah is, the Houthis in Lebanon are, who have also attempted to attack Israel and Israeli shipping and international shipping in the Red Sea. There are networks in Iranian proxy networks in Syria and in Iraq, all of whom have attacked Israel during the course of this conflict. And indeed, as you all know, Iran attacked itself on the 14th of April with, I believe, around 400 to 450 ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones, which achieved very little damage. I think the total damage caused by all that large number of missiles was minor damage to an Israeli airfield and the unfortunate serious wounding of an Arab child inside Israel. And as a Brit, I am particularly proud of the fact that the Royal Air Force flew in defense of Israel on that night, alongside the United States Air Force and the Jordanian Air Force. But I think it's something all of those people who are friends of Israel can be proud of, that their international allies came to their aid on that occasion. It was a particular miracle also because it's the first time that I've ever known the Royal Air Force to fly at weekends. They normally want to be in their hotels or at home at weekends, but we managed to get them out and up in the air over Iraq to deal with some of these missiles. I'm sorry, that was a slight swipe at the IDF, at the RAF. I apologize to anyone who served in air forces anywhere, who are always the butt of jokes by we ground soldiers, but nevertheless hugely appreciated. I was in Jerusalem that night, and I witnessed overhead of Jerusalem a very large number of Iranian missiles being intercepted by Hamas, by IDF air defense systems. Deeply impressive. And the IDF then launched what I think was also an impressive retaliation against that some days later when they launched missiles into Iran. And those missiles, I think the message that was sent by them was extremely important. They weren't devastating in numbers, they were a relatively small number, but the IDF showed they could penetrate Iranian air defenses at its strongest point. Isfahan is the most protected part of Iran, with Russian S-300 anti-aircraft air defense missiles. And the reason it's so heavily protected because it's one of the key elements of the Iranian nuclear program. And the IDF showed they can get through to that without warning and without being intercepted. That's very important, both in terms of deterring future attacks against Israel and also maybe at least giving Iran pause to maybe suspend its nuclear operations until they're able to construct much more effective air defenses, because the likelihood is, I believe, that that if Israel gets to the point where it realizes, where it believes that Iran has the present capability to use nuclear weapons, and we're not far off that now, then the IDF will have no choice other than to launch military operations against Iran. So a very complex, very difficult situation. Interwoven with all of that, of course, is the disgraceful, shameful behavior of international organizations like the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court. The ICJ, as you know, South Africa launched a case in the ICJ accusing Israel of genocide. That was the most obscene act against Israel in the international arena that I have ever seen. Accusing a country that is defending itself against a genocidal terrorist organization of genocide itself. Shameful and shocking. Of course, we shouldn't forget, it's Hamas who wish to perpetrate a genocide. Their charter says that explicitly, their leaders explain that, and their actions demonstrate that it's their genuine intention. So it's not Israel, as you all know, it's not Israel that is thinking about or hoping to achieve a genocide. They are defending against genocide from their enemies in Hamas. And the final point to make, I think, the International Criminal Court may be about to launch indictments and arrest warrants against senior Israeli leadership, Prime Minister Netanyahu, Defense Minister Gallant, and possibly the Chief of Staff Halevi. That's, I think, their intention. It may happen today. The original thinking, I think, was they would issue these indictments today or maybe tomorrow. My biggest concern about this, obviously, it's another complete miscarriage of justice by what is effectively a political kangaroo court. And my biggest concern is that they've been encouraged by America to do this as another means of putting pressure on Israel. Even though America has now come out and said that they're opposed to this, I still think that the hands of the White House are behind this potential ICC action. Okay, I've probably spoken too long. I'm very happy to take any questions you may have on those issues or any other related issues or unrelated issues, whatever you want to ask, I'm happy to talk about. I'm a bit like a barber or a taxi driver. I can speak on any subject.
Well, thank you so much, Colonel Kemp. That was a very, very thorough briefing. I had some questions prepared and you managed to answer them all. So thank you so much for that. We're going to take questions from the audience. I can see we've got more than a dozen hands raised. But before we do that, we're going to go to Michael Bird and myself, who just say a few words. But even before we do that, David Adler is going to give us an update about what's happening, and we'll go to those.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you, Richard, for that terrific outline. As we do each week at the end of the event, if you're not yet actively supporting AJA, please go to the website, jewishassociation.org.au, and become a supporter, make a contribution. Don't be a freeloader. Make sure you've signed up to the email list to get notification of information and events. Now, next week is going to be a little bit different because, as Richard alluded to, he's coming to Australia, and we are doing the premiere screenings in Sydney and Melbourne next week of the Whose Land movie, and we will be fortunate at both the Melbourne and Sydney events to have with us the producer, Hugh Kitson, and the narrator commentator, Col Richard Kemp, who is also our guest this evening. You'll find that the booking links, which are essential that you get a ticket, have been sent out in our emails. They're also being available on our social media. So if you're in Sydney or Melbourne, make sure you get a ticket. Sydney's the 7th of May, Melbourne is the 9th of May. We'll be doing other events with Richard Kemp, but they're the two big ones in the first week. So Sydney and Melbourne people, This is a huge opportunity. Don't miss it.
And I will say tickets have been booking very quickly. So if you want to secure your spot right after this talk, you should definitely book. The 2 links are in the Zoom. So first over to Michael.
Yes, Richard, are you getting, you've been in Israel for quite a while. What's the feeling amongst the Israelis? 2 things. First of all, there's a lot of people that are obviously not happy with Netanyahu. But in your opinion, on the 7th of October, if it was any other coalition in charge at the time, would they have handled this whole operation in Gaza any differently? And also your feelings about the public at large in Israel. Do you think the majority are still supportive of Israel's incursion into Gaza?
Thank you, Michael. I don't believe any Israeli government, whatever its composition, would have been able to act in any different way from the way that the current government acted. That Israel was subject to an invasion by what is effectively a foreign country, supported by a major country in the region, of course, Iran, and probably directed by Iran as well. And the Israeli government had absolutely no choice other than to deal with it as it has. I've heard many people say that it should have been done differently. The IDF should be acting differently. I've heard many military experts, academic experts, politicians say that, and I've spoken to many of them, and not one of them has given me a different way. They're happy to criticize. They're not so happy to come up with better or different solutions. So no, I don't think any government would have been able to do it differently. The level of effectiveness, the handling of the international arena, all of these different issues that are so deeply connected. Obviously, different politicians might have dealt with them differently, less or more effectively. But I don't think ultimately the basic actions of Israel could have been any different from what they are now. In terms of the Israeli population, as everybody knows, before the war began, Israeli politics was very, very deeply polarized over judicial reform, particularly. I think it was probably the most divided I have seen Israel. That's the opposite occurred when I arrived on the 9th of October. Israel was totally united. I think there was virtually no dissent from the actions of the Israeli government. The only divisions I've witnessed inside Israel, which have kind of intensified a little bit in over time, is between those people who believe that everything should be done to get the hostages back, including stopping the war against Hamas. Everything should be done. And I can sympathize and understand that as well. But then there are those who believe that the most important thing is to annihilate Hamas, to prevent Hamas from continuing to threaten Israel. And those 2 objectives, to an extent, are in tension with each other. Although I believe personally that the best way to get the hostages back is to increase the military pressure on Hamas. I think to cease fire, and of course there are discussions going on now essentially between the US, Egypt, Qatar, Israel, and Hamas about a potential ceasefire in exchange for hostage release. That wouldn't have come about. We don't know whether it's going to materialize or whether it will be a good thing or not, but it wouldn't have come about, as indeed the previous hostage release wouldn't have come about, without intense military pressure on Hamas. But that is, I think, the only division that I'm aware of really within Israel.
Thanks. Robert?
All right, so we're going to go to some questions. So just a reminder, 1 question per person, keep it very brief. We've got like dozens of questions. So first up, and no statements, just ask something. First up, we have very privileged to have film producer Hugh Kitson, who will be coming to Australia. Ask your question.
Hello, Richard. This is slightly a departure from Gaza itself, although a consequence. And one would think that the whole idea of a two-state solution after the 7th of October would be off the table, full stop. But now you're getting the Biden administration, British Foreign Secretary, and so on, trying to push for a two-state solution. Could you tell us what the effect of the imposition of a two-state solution upon Israel at this time, what would that do as far as Israel's concerned?
Well, thank you very much, Hugh. Very good question. And I'm looking forward to seeing you at the premiere screening of Whose Land in Sydney. It's been too long. But as to your question, I don't believe a two-state solution can be imposed on Israel. I think Israel would have to agree to any political situation like that. I also believe that it's obviously completely ridiculous for these politicians to be pressing for a two-state solution at this time. And some people would argue, and I would argue, it's not feasible at any time, but certainly not at this time. But I think the reason these people are not, people like Biden, Blinken, Cameron, Sunak here, and your politicians in Australia are not, this may be a controversial comment, but I don't believe they're entirely stupid. And they must know that it's a completely impossible demand to make. And I think the reason they're making it is entirely to appease the anti-Israel electorate. Both the UK and the US have general elections coming up at the end of this year. The politicians want votes from both pro and anti-Israel voters. And so this is one of the reasons why they're churning out yet again this very glib, meaningless term two-state solution, which is an impossibility. For one thing, the Palestinians do not want it. They do not sign up to it. Recent polling shows the majority of people don't support it. Their leaders definitely don't support it. It's therefore not going to happen from their perspective. All they want, all the leadership want anyway, not necessarily all the people, is the annihilation of the state of Israel. They want a one-state solution, and that is an Islamic state. So it can't happen from that perspective, nor can it happen from the Israeli perspective. I don't need to go into detail. We saw what happened on the 7th of October. Before the 7th of October, there was effectively a two-state solution, Israel and Gaza. It was a two-state solution. They were they were on their own. They had their own autonomy. We saw what happened as a result of that. So I think you can put down these ridiculous calls for a two-state solution to an attempt to appease, in the same way as people like our Prime Minister, like your own government in Australia and like the US government are talking about how Israel is carrying out indiscriminate killings. They're breaking the laws of war. We encourage them to stick to the laws of war. All of these platitudes. They know it's not true. They know that the IDF strictly sticks to the laws of war, but they feel they have to say it in order to try and garner votes from the anti-Israel mobs in their own countries.
Yeah, but I would say AJA is the only major Australian Jewish organization that has been saying since we were created, no two-state solution. So next up, Nimrod, would you like to ask your question?
Hi. So it's actually quite connected to that, although maybe a bit less straightforward. What is your take on the initiative to form a coalition of regional moderate Arab nations backed by US and other Western powers that will act as an Arab peacekeeping force in Gaza? Coalition that hopes to offer temporary governance there until it will enable a slow transition to a terror-free Palestinian Authority, meaning one that does agree for a two-state solution. That's my question.
Good question.
Yeah, I think there are numerous options being discussed for a post-war Gaza whenever we get to that point, and a coalition of Arab governments, Arab forces, whatever, Arab elements with US support to govern Gaza, or at least to organize the reconstruction of Gaza I think is one of those options, which is a viable possibility if the Arab governments are willing to sign up to that. It's obviously not a standalone solution. I think you also need, without a doubt, you need some kind of internal Gazan governance. And I know that there have been actions or initiatives to try and identify Gazan leaders who are not associated with Hamas or indeed the Palestinian Authority to take some kind of lead in running Gaza, maybe dividing it into different parts led by different leaders if they can be identified and found and given enough money to do an effective job. So that, I think, could be a part of that equation. But I would come back to the point I made before as well. Although Israel doesn't want to run Gaza, and I think it would be a bad thing for Israel to attempt to run Gaza from an administrative point of view, the IDF will have no choice other than to maintain security control over Gaza. You can put together whatever coalition of Arabs and Americans and UN and anyone else you like, but Israel cannot rely on that, whatever it is composed of, cannot rely on that potential coalition to maintain, to guarantee the security of Israel. So the IDF is going to have to stay there. Now, whether that means a permanent IDF presence of thousands of soldiers in bases inside Gaza, whether it means the construction of areas of Gaza, I'm searching for the right word, of buffer zones, shall we say, around the Gaza, inside the Gaza border, and maybe inside Gaza itself, in which the IDF can freely operate, come and go, etc. I don't know. That's a tactical detail to be decided by the IDF, but there will have to be overwhelming security responsibility for Gaza by the IDF and nobody else.
Okay, next up we have Andy.
Okay. Richard, I met you in February. I live in Israel. And living in Israel, the one thing that really bothers me is the rise of pro-Palestinian protests at the different universities in Australia, the UK, and in America. And I'm wondering, is Iran behind it? Is somebody paying money? And are these really students? Lastly, what can we as civilians do in this matter? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good to see you again. I remember when we met. This what we're seeing on the university campuses and elsewhere in our countries, on the streets, in parliaments, things like that. This is the result, not necessarily the culmination, but certainly a culminating point of decades of anti-Israel propaganda, which began, of course, in the 1960s. And we see the same slogans today: apartheid, genocide. We've seen it all, illegal occupation. We've seen it all from the 1960s, originally orchestrated from the Soviet Union to try and create a war of national liberation inside Israel, which didn't exist previously. There was, of course, conflict, but they wanted to turn a religious war into a war of national liberation. And they created this whole anti-Israel campaign, partly as a weapon against the United States and British power in the Middle East. But you know, we're at the point, it's developed to the point where now the narrative is Israel is an illegitimate entity. Israel deprived Arabs of their land. Israel is an illegal occupier. Israel carries out illegal settlements. Israel is carrying out genocide. It's an apartheid government, all of which are lies. Every single thing I said there are not the truth. They are all lies. But that is what many people understand. Most people, not most people perhaps, but many people, particularly on university campuses. Therefore, anything Israel does, because of that agenda, everything Israel does is wrong. Anything that happens to Israel, including the 7th of October, is right. That's the background. It is all, a large amount of it is funded. There are other organizations around the world that are helping fund it, but a lot of it is also funded by Iran. It's funded by Qatar. And you can see not only that, but also by China and Russia, which are, of course, they're not necessarily hoping for the victory of Hamas, except in as much as it will be damaging to United States prestige and influence in the region. So all of these people are funding. You can see that by the organization, by the uniformity of the protests that are taking place, particularly in the United States. So it's completely orchestrated. There are many students involved. Many of them, I've spoken to many students involved in protests for decades against Israel, including in the University of Sydney, where I had the pleasure of a major demonstration that prevented me from speaking for about half an hour a few years back. But many of the ones I've spoken to, they chant from the river to the sea. They don't know what river they're talking about. They don't know what sea they're talking about. They couldn't point out Israel on a map. Many of them are paid to demonstrate. Many of them demonstrate because it's the right virtue signaling woke thing to do. There are other motives as well, of course. Some genuinely believe that the best way to help the Palestinian people is to protest against Israel because they take in the anti-Israel propaganda that's so prevalent in the media. And I think the worst, one of the worst elements of this is the Jews who are protesting against Israel, and there are an increasing number of those. That's the most dangerous element in my view. And that has been the objective of some of these anti-Israel organizations in the US, like Students for Justice in Palestine and the Palestine Solidarity Campaign in the UK. That's their objective, to turn Jews against Israel. It's one of their major objectives. And it is something that I think anyone who has any influence over Jewish students should be doing their best to resist. In many cases, I think Jewish students aren't protesting against Israel because they hate Israel. They're protesting against Israel, or even not standing up for Israel, because they're afraid of the pressure and the hate they will receive from their peers for not doing so. Like any other young people, they want to be popular, they want to be accepted, they don't want to go against the grain. As to what we can do about all this, I think I would say that anyone who's in a position to do so should do everything and anything they possibly can to help and support Jewish students who are, I think, in the crosshairs of these protests, of protests all around the world. So, I don't have any immediate solution, but anything that can be done to help and support and encourage them should be done. One thing I do believe that should happen, and I don't hold out much hope of it, but I'm thinking about Britain here, the same could apply to any other country. When the Ukraine war began, the British government realized that we needed to provide massive support, financial support, military support to Ukraine against Russia. We also knew that it was going to be very damaging economically. And therefore, we produced a very effective and intensive public information campaign run by the government, by elements of the government like the Foreign Ministry, the Home Office, the Ministry of Defence and other elements, to show the British people why it was necessary to support Ukraine. Now, in the face of all the lies that are told against Israel at the moment, I believe our government, certainly in Britain, probably Australia as well, has a responsibility to replicate that public information campaign, to get out there the truth about what Israel is doing and what Hamas are all about. And it's not a matter of becoming a mouthpiece for Israel, far from it. I think it's very important both to undermine the pro-Hamas propaganda, because Hamas threatens all of us, not just Israel, Hamas and its ideology, but also to protect Jewish people in our own country who are the victims of so much of this hate. The government has a responsibility, in my view, to correct a lot of the lies. Like I say, I'm not optimistic that that's going to happen.
And it's been crazy what's been happening at the universities here. AJA has been in close communication with students at the University of Queensland who've set up a counter-protest, and we've also been organising a counter-protest at the University of Sydney, which maybe we'll be able to say more about. Okay, next up we have Marcus. Would you like to ask your question?
Hi, it's actually Marcus's mum, Charlotte. My question for Colonel Kemp, is things are pretty dire in the UK under the Conservative Tory government and with the influence of Lord David Cameron. How much worse will they be under Keir Starmer and Labor, bearing in mind that despite the fact that Sir Keir is married to a Jewish-born, although not practicing, Jewish woman, he was Jeremy Corbyn's right-hand man?
Very good question.
A very good question, Charlotte. Thank you very much. Firstly, I believe the British government has been very strong in its support for Israel. And I'm talking about particularly, I think, the practical support that the British government's given. Military assistance as well. Not only the RAF defence of Israel on the 14th of April, but other different forms of support that you and I don't know about and probably won't know about. But I think the government has been strong. As I mentioned before, the government also, unfortunately, and weakly, believes that it needs to appease anti-Israel elements in the electorate. So that, I think, that accounts more than anything else for some of the negative reports we've heard of from the British government. I'm not saying they're perfect. I'm not saying they're doing a good job, but I think they've been pretty strong. I believe that, and that most people are predicting now that the Labour Party will win the general election by a significant margin, which will put Keir Starmer in office, and the Labour Party. I believe the Labour Party is still Corbyn's Labour Party. Yeah, it's got a different leader, it's got different wallpaper and all the rest of it, but I think it's the same thing. It's made up to a very large extent of members of Parliament and councillors and other supporters who are anti-Israel. The same people, with few exceptions, as were there under Starmer. Having said that, the Labour Party has been very strong in its support of Israel since the war began. It's basically followed the government line to a large extent. But from as far as I can see, that is entirely for electoral purposes, because I think the majority of people in Britain, no matter what noise you hear, no matter the shrieking of the protesters, I believe the majority of people in Britain support Israel and back Israel. And of course, those people are voters. So the Labour Party wants their votes, as well as the anti-Israel votes. And that's why I think they've been strong in their support for Israel. But that will end when they come into power. Labour MPs, councillors and others have been biting their tongues over Israel. They're desperate to lay into Israel at the moment, but they've been convinced politically it doesn't make sense. But the muzzles will come off when they get into power. And I believe that under a Labour government, the UK will probably become one of Israel's, if not Israel's, worst enemy in Europe, because the UK is very influential in Europe, even though we're not in the EU, and influential around the world. And if we turn on Israel, which I believe the Labour government will turn on Israel, even to the extent probably of recognising a so-called Palestinian state, and thereby destroying diplomatic relations between Israel and Britain, I think that's almost an inevitability. I very much hope I'm wrong.
All right, let's see how quickly we can get through the next few questions. Kiel, would you like to ask your question?
Hello, Colonel Kemp, how are you? I can confirm from your earlier comment that the Australian Army does think the same thing of the RAAF, so it's already been a few comments in the chat here on that. Just to ask, sort of, thinking of the Israeli soldiers and your experiences with them that are operating in a urban environment. I'll think back to my own limited training in how we would sort of deal with that and how stressful it is. Do you think the Israeli army, obviously the will to fight's not in question. They're probably the best army in the Middle East, but how would that be, fatigue and things like that operating in that environment be managed amongst them? Do you think the Israeli army has a good process for doing that, considering the operational tempo seems to be insane there at the moment? Thank you.
I'll make I'm very pleased to see you've got a picture of my regiment in Afghanistan behind you, the 44th Foot. But I think I'll make a couple of quick points. First of all, there are many armies in the world who have observers in Israel, seeing how Israel is fighting the war now, trying to learn lessons from Israel. And that includes the US, UK, and I would expect it would include Australians as well, watching very closely to learn from the way that Israel is operating, and also from armies, Arab armies in the Middle East. I know for a fact that some of their representatives have been in Israel since the war began. In terms of the length of the conflict, this is the longest conflict that Israel has had to fight since the War of Independence by a significant measure. And it obviously takes its toll. There's been I think, relatively small number of Israeli casualties, but nevertheless significant. Small by comparison to, I think, what was expected at this stage. But one thing I would say is that the commitment and the morale of Israeli soldiers at the moment is sky high. You would expect after 6 months of fighting for them to want to go home, get it done with, and get back to living their lives, particularly the reservists. But that's the opposite of the truth. In some cases, when units have been stood down from action in Gaza and gone home for a rest or whatever, they've protested against that. They've actively protested against leaving the war. This is not because they're warmongers. It's not because they're bloodthirsty, but it's because all of them, including the Australians fighting out there and other lone soldiers from around the world, they all know how important this fight is. And Israelis are fighting on their doorstep. It's not like Afghanistan or Iraq, where we fight thousands of miles from home. These people are fighting directly and immediately for the lives of their families, their friends, their country, their citizens.
Janet, next up. Still muted.
Mute. Thank you. Janet's next to me. The question I have for Richard is this: how should the IDF deal with Albanese's appointed senior military advisor to talk about what happened to the 7 World Kitchen workers who were inadvertently targeted? What should Israel do? And should Binskin, who's the person who's been appointed, should he have actually declined this?
Well, I'd be very happy when I'm in Australia to have a chat with this gentleman and maybe point him in the right direction if he's willing to speak to me. But I don't know who he is. I don't know whether he should have accepted or declined. But I'll just say a word about the World Central Kitchen. This has been, I think President Biden said this is totally unacceptable. What the IDF did, totally unacceptable. The reality, of course, is that these things happen in war. They're terrible, but they happen frequently. Something like 19% of all IDF soldiers that have been killed in Gaza have been killed by friendly fire. This is no one could suggest this is deliberate. It's the result of the kind of confusion and chaos and errors that you get in every war. And I would have said to President Biden that may have been unacceptable, but it was also in that case it was totally unacceptable what happened in August 2021 when the US was withdrawing from Afghanistan and they bombed a Taliban network in Kabul, which turned out not to be a Taliban network, but turned out to be a US employed aid worker and 9 members of his family, including 7 children. They killed them by mistake. And it was actually not dissimilar because it was also the result of a misidentification of a vehicle that led to the strike, as was the case with the World Central Kitchen. There's been no suggestion that that was a deliberate war crime. There's been no suggestion that that was unacceptable. Of course, it was terrible, but it's what happens in war. No one was, as far as I know, nobody was indicted, arrested, punished, or fired as a result of that operation. The reality is that when Israel makes mistakes of this nature in war, it's a war crime. When any other country does, it's a tragic accident.
Yep, I think we're on time. To Neil, if you want to close off.
Just like to say We didn't get around to answering everyone's questions, but as we've mentioned many times, Richard will be in Sydney and Melbourne next week. So if we didn't get a chance to come around to you, please join us in person. And we really, really encourage you to join us at our in-person events. It makes a big difference to our organization to having these incredible speakers who are coming here from Israel, from the UK, Hugh Kitson, Richard Kemp, to have them in person is an incredible opportunity. So please book your ticket, support the events. They'll be on Tuesday evening in Sydney and Thursday evening in Melbourne. Thank you to everybody who's joined us this evening. It's been an incredible, informative evening. Richard, you are one of our most prestigious guests, and it is always a pleasure to have you with the AJA and have you involved. And we are so looking forward to seeing you in person with you next week, Tuesday night, Thursday night. Book your tickets, share this recording around with your friends and family on our YouTube, on our Facebook page, and we will see you in person Tuesday and Thursday. Good evening, everybody.